very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and especially the opportunity to follow Chris. Chris has known Chris for a long time. Did you start the graduate school in 91? 92? 91. That's when I started graduate school in 91. So we were there together. I was rookie teacher at the graduate level for him, and he was a rookie student, I guess. I don't know. I guess that's what that means. But he was an excellent student, and I won't embarrass him telling you about him. But it was really good to hear what he had to say, because he did laid a foundation for us all for today. Everything we're going to do today. Is that me? It's all right? We're good? Oh, I need to use the podium? Okay. So this is not going to work. This off. Well, that means I have to stay right here. That could be a problem, you know. I can't pick it up and move it, can I? Well, grateful for the opportunity and for the invitation to share some thoughts with you about the shack. And I think Chris laid a wonderful foundation for us in terms of the whole day. That really at the heart of any walk through woundedness has to be this central core conviction that we are loved. Whenever that gets shaken, whenever that begins to crumble, there is no healing. And so I'm grateful for how Chris has led us into that particular idea. You know, the shack was written in 2007. It was published by Paul Young. And it was a blockbuster book on the best time, you know, the New York Times bestseller list for a long time. And it caused quite a stir in a lot of quarters in different ways. And I remember the reason I read it for the first time was had been asked by several people, you know, what do you think about the shack? And I'm saying, well, I don't know. I haven't read the shack, you know. That's kind of fiction. You know, I read theology, okay? But finally I did read it, and the first time I read it, I had some tears, and it had some impact, but the moment when I read it, and I remember exactly when I read it on an airplane going to Dallas, Texas, for a weekend seminar in February 2, 3, something like that, in 2008. And it didn't sink into my soul at that moment. Because in that moment, my soul was plastered over. I had my Hollywood front up in front of my own shack. And I had kind of a barrier that wouldn't let anything get into my shack. And so it kind of rolled off of me. But in the next few days, I had what 12-step calls my own awakening, a spiritual awakening. I called it originally a crash. In some ways it still was a crash, but it's also an awakening. And I began to walk through my own woundedness in ways that, with the kinds of depth that I had not previously done. And after about 6 months, I was asked to give a presentation on the shack. Now, the reason I was asked to do this is because Ruby Shelley was supposed to do it. And he's such an untrustworthy fellow that he had to bow out at the last minute. And so within kind of a week, they asked me to make a presentation on the shack. Or it was a little longer than that. It was more than a week, I guess. But that was a moment of God work for me. Because what that enabled me to do was to reread the shack. And when I read it the second time, I saw themes and perspectives that illuminated my own journey, that resonated with me. And as I read it the second time, I began to see that really what was going on here was a very central question. And the question is, how do wounded people truly come to believe that God is especially fond of them? Which is the question that Chris was talking about. How do wounded people truly come to believe? Let it sink deep in their souls. Let it be the very fabric that envelops their souls, that they are God's beloved, that they are God's bridegroom. How do you get from the point of being so wounded that you fill yourself with self-hatred, you fill yourself with a sense of failure, of unworthiness, of toxic shame? How do you live in that, exist in that woundedness, and in any way attempt to try to see how God considers you beloved? Because you don't love yourself. You don't love yourself. And if anybody else really knew who you were, they wouldn't love you either. And God knows who I am. How can he love me? And so in that second reading of the shack, that question emerged as the primary lens for me. And so I started reading about Paul Young. He was giving presentations across the country, and you can find all this material on the internet. I'm not sharing any secrets. But Paul Young has his own story, his own personal story of woundedness. He was a child, a third culture child, you might say, missionary kid growing up in New Guinea, where he experienced sexual abuse from his peers. His father was emotionally distant. And so he grew up in a context where he did not feel the affection of a father, where he did not experience the love of a father, at least from his childhood lenses. And he had to deal with the abuse. One of the things that's important to remember about Paul Young in terms of reading The Shack, which I didn't know the first time I read The Shack, was that in that experience of New Guinea, the only place where he found affection was in the love of women of color. That's where he found love. That's where he experienced love. I think that's important for the story that he tells in The Shack. And as Paul Young tells it, he became kind of a performer, a religious addict, you might say. A performer, to perform for others and to perform for God in order to earn, in order to gain attention, approval. Became a workaholic in that kind of context. Went to Bible college and then seminary. ultimately at a church, performing, and ultimately succumbing because the woundedness was not healed. The wounds persisted. And when wounds persist, they fester. When they fester, they break out in sores, and they ultimately raise their ugly head. And he fell as a minister. The story of the shack is actually Paul Young's theological framing for his own 10-year journey of recovery. Those 10 years are put into these few pages. Those 10 years are put into a weekend. A weekend which summarizes, I think, for his own children, his own journey. Because you see, Missy in the shack is his own wounded child. It's his own innocent childhood that was killed. And as he struggles as Paul Young tells this story of how he came to learn, came to believe, came to experience God's love, came to see himself as God's beloved. It's a story he squeezes into a weekend for the sake of what I call a parable. In fact, Paul Young calls it a parable too. The shack is a parable. It's not intended to be, a movie. Well, I guess it's a movie now, but it's a parable about that relationship between Mac and God, which is Paul Young's own story about his own journey of woundedness. And what I discovered in rereading The Shack and seeing it through those lenses, and when I read it the second time, I saw all kinds of language of recovery there. I saw all kinds of spirituality. I saw all kinds of recovery language and theology that intersected in a way in order to bring this point to a head. How do wounded people come to believe that God is especially fond of them? I want to concentrate today on kind of two themes that emerge out of the shack. Two that were particularly important for me in my own awakening. The first theme is what Paul Young calls the great sadness. And I want to concentrate on that one first. This afternoon, we'll focus on another theme, and that's forgiveness. And I think the two are deeply connected. And I'll try to connect them in a helpful way, I hope. But this afternoon, when we talk about forgiveness, I want to talk about kind of three levels of forgiveness. One, forgiving others, because Mac has to learn to forgive his father. And Mac has to learn to forgive the murderer. But also Mac has to learn to forgive himself. After all, he didn't save Missy. Right? But most importantly, it seems to me, and really at the root of the other two, is that Mac had to learn to forgive God. Now I know forgiving God can be kind of a shocking way of saying that. And I'm not going to take time to explain that at this moment. We'll wait till this afternoon. I have to give you some reason to come back, right? So you can figure out what that is. What forgiving God is like. But let's begin with the great sadness. First time I read that in the book, that language resonated with me because I know what my great sadness is. If someone were to say, okay, what is your wound? What is your hurt? What is the pain in your life? And what is it that has kind of stuck with you? What is that wound that has festered over all your life? I don't know that I could have identified it the first time I read the book in the way that I can now. But great sadness is a way of talking about that. One's great sadness is one's great woundedness. And the woundedness, of course, for Mac was the loss of his daughter. But that woundedness went deep because it was also about the woundedness of his father. How his father had wounded him. About the woundedness in Paul Young's life of sexual abuse. And so wounds go deep and they go long, right? They have a history. And if there's not a healing path for the woundedness, there's an infectious path for the woundedness. It festers. And it develops sores. For me, the great woundedness in my life has been grief. The great sadness in which I found myself stuck, as the Shack puts it, was grief. It goes back to the death of my first wife in 1980. Sheila and I were married for 2 years, 11 months, and 10 days. She had surgery on her back, which was to correct her scoliosis, curvature of her spine. We had already lost one child in miscarriage, and the doctors were telling us that it would be very difficult for her to carry children full term unless she had this operation. So we decided to have that operation. She died of a blood clot 10 days after the surgery. Totally new experience for me, of course. I was totally alien from grief. I had no experience of grief to speak of. I had no experience in my family. I had no experience in my churches that I can really remember. But that grief knocked me off my heels. And because it shattered what I thought I had with God. You see, I thought, and I wouldn't have necessarily described it this way when I was 21 years old, 22 years old. But as I look back on it, I can see this is what I was thinking. I had this kind of mechanistic understanding of God. Right? God and I have a deal. You do your part, I'll do my part. And I'm going to serve you, and you're going to bless me. And so this kind of quid pro quo relationship with God was kind of the world in which I lived. I don't know how I got that world. I mean, I got some theories, I guess, but that's the world that I thought in. However it came, that's the world in which I thought. And so when Sheila died, when all our plans were to be the servant of God and be missionaries and, all down the line, all these great things I was going to do for God, right? And Sheila dies, my first thought is God has betrayed me. Kind of like Psalm 44. So that deep wound, there were times when I thought I had worked through that. I didn't know myself as well as I thought I did. My great sadness also includes further grief. In 2001, my son Joshua died. He was born with a terminal genetic condition. He died at the age of 16. Let me tell you a story. that maybe will take us into a moment here that I want to build on. When Sheila died, we had the funeral in North Georgia, and of course I had no idea what funerals in North Georgia were like. Never been to one in North Georgia. But apparently you sit with the body for 2 days in North Georgia, at least at that time, in that place, that moment. And it's kind of a grueling experience. And the whole town is coming through. On the day of the funeral, the practice in North Georgia apparently was for the whole assembly to exit the building and the family be left with the body and the casket reopened and the final viewing of the body and then the casket closed. And then the family would walk out the front door of the church. And of course, I have no clue what's waiting for me outside the front door of the church. I thought, at the best, maybe we're going to get in the cars and go to the graveside. But when I walked out the front door of the church, being carried basically by my family members, because I was so overwhelmed and so stricken that I was basically carried out the front door on the shoulders of family members. And when they opened the doors, and I'm the first one out, the whole town is right there on the grass outside the church. And this was my emotion. I was embarrassed. And somewhere along the way, maybe even in that very moment, I said, this will never happen to me again. I will never be embarrassed like this again. And what I learned to do was to suppress my grief. I learned not to show it. At Joshua's funeral, I didn't even cry. I cried in private, but I didn't show it. You see, I think there's something about, and this is in the shack when he refers to being stuck in the great sadness. Stuck in the great sadness. That resonated with me because that's exactly how I see my life. I was stuck there. I was stuck there because the wound was not healed. It was just festered. And when something would trigger the wound, when something would trigger the grief, I would not grieve. I would medicate. I would cope in unhealthy ways. And so the grief stayed with me, and it was stuck there. And I think that part of being stuck in grief, in the great sadness, is that the great sadness becomes sort of your identity. And that's how the shack puts it. That Max, the death of his daughter, became his identity. Death became the death of my son or my wife. Grief became my identity. It became the very thing that colored everything I saw. In fact, in the shack you have this language of the colorless world, right? That Mac lives in this gray, dingy world. Because when you are grieving and when you're stuck in the grief and when you're stuck in the great sadness, everything looks gray. There can't be great joy Because if you have great joy, then it's as if you have betrayed the one you love. Because how can there be great joy when they're not here? You can see this in The Shack as well. Remember when Mac is, and if you haven't read The Shack, then you're in the wrong place. But, because it's coming right here. You remember in The Shack, he's gone to the shack, and he has gone there to meet God, and God doesn't show up, and so he's angry, and he starts breaking stuff, and he starts throwing stuff around, and he falls exhausted on the floor, falls asleep, wakes up, and he says, okay, God, I'm done. You didn't show up, I'm done. And he walks out the shack, starts walking up the hill, and then the scene changes. And he starts hearing laughter. And there's laughter coming from the shack. And he turns around and he sees the shack, and now it's a cabin. A manicured cabin with a nice lake and beautiful scenery. And he's mad. And he's angry. Because there's laughter coming from the place where Missy died. And when you live in a colorless world, when you live in a world stuck in the great sadness, you can't take the laughter. It seems out of place. How can there be joy in the shack where Missy died? How can there be joy in my heart that is stuck in the great sadness? The joy doesn't fit. Now, you can use humor in ways to deflect that, which was one of my fortes, to deflect the pain and not engage it, not live through it. Stuck in the great sadness. I think this is one of the brilliant moments in the shack that helped me see some things in a new way. Helped me work through my own recovery. And that is, it's this key point. And it's the point that Chris was talking about. What is my identity? When we are stuck in the great sadness, when we are stuck in the woundedness, it is the woundedness that is our identity. And we will fight to keep that identity. We may not necessarily like it, that identity, but it's our identity. This is my life. This is what happened. This is who I am. And this is the kind of hero I need to be for the sake of others. Or whatever that kind of coping mechanism is, or the family role you might play. Stuck in the great sadness. It happens when the great sadness becomes our identity. Here's, I think, the wonderful point. That when God welcomes Mac into the house, into the shack, and Mac opens that door, a door where he doesn't know what he's going to find, but he's going to come face to face with God. Now, if he'd come face to face with his father, maybe the scene wouldn't have gone so well there, right? But he came face to face with Papa. So that African-American woman who picked him up and hugged him and said, "I'm especially fond of you." And as he enters the shack of his own world, the shack of his own great sadness, he begins to see and experience life in the relationship of the Father, Son, and Spirit. He begins to experience their love for one another. He sees them dancing over in the corner, Jesus and the Holy Spirit dancing together. He watches them at the table enjoy the fellowship of one another. He sees their love for each other, their unity and their harmony. And he experiences their invitation. And he experiences their love for him. Yeah, they know he's mad. They know he's wounded. They know that he's got a lot of thoughts in his head that are crazy. But they sit at the table with him. And they walk with him. And they talk with him. It is that picture, it's that emotional, parabolic entry into the Father-Son relationship that one can begin to see themselves at the center of God's world rather than to see themselves at the center of their own. The ability to move from self-hatred and self-pity and unworthiness, lack of worthiness, and to move into a relationship, into a setting where you are loved, that it shifts Mac's identity. He came into the shack feeling and sensing that his world was about his grief. His world was about his wounds. That's what really identified him. That's what made him who he is. That's what was important about him, was his wounds. As much as that sounds really strange. And what he discovered by being in the presence of God and experiencing this inner Trinitarian communion, he began to experience a belovedness. And he found his identity in being beloved rather than in being wounded. There are a lot of scenes in there that I think are really helpful and important. Let me just focus on one for a moment. And it's this relationship between Papa and Mac, where Papa weeps with Mac. Now, when Papa weeps, what is the resource of that weeping? I mean, when I weep, the resource of that weeping is often my woundedness. But for when Papa weeps because Papa loves. Papa weeps because her identity is love. God is love. And when Papa weeps out of the resource of love. She weeps out of her identity. The weeping doesn't become her identity. She weeps out of her identity. And that is a really important shift, it seems to me. It's a shift that Mac has to make in his healing. Because as long as Mac is stuck in the great sadness, Mac will not heal. the wounds will fester. And the move that has to happen is to shift one's identity from the woundedness to the circle of the divine love. And when we find our identity there, we can still weep. We can still mourn. We can still lament. Just as Papa does. But her weeping doesn't become her soul. It doesn't become her identity. Now, making that move is tough. Because it involves a trust. What wounds do for us, or what wounds do to us, is they break our trusters. This little mechanism in our soul. I got this from a good friend of mine in the program. He says, my truster was broken. I said, what do you mean by that? Well, I just couldn't. I've been so hurt by people, I can't trust anybody. I don't know how to trust anybody. Trusting is risky. Trusting is painful. Trusting has never worked. My truster is broken. And I think that's what woundedness does to us. It breaks our trusters. We are unable to trust. So the move from great sadness to a experience of God's love for us involves learning to trust again and learning to trust God, which also involves learning to forgive God, but more on that later. And that's what shows up in the shack as well. Because you remember in the Here Come the Judge chapter, it said, here's what's really going on, Matt. You don't trust that I am good. You don't really believe that I'm good. How do we come to believe that God is especially fond of us? Seems to me there are a lot of factors that come into play there. Several of them have to do with community. Several of them have to do with learning the story, hearing the story again. But in terms of this conference and the Nurture Conference and the sort of things that the Institute for Spirituality does here, and what you're familiar with, those practices of spiritual formation are an entry into the experience of Mac's own weekend. How do we have a weekend like Mac? How does that parable come alive for us? And I believe that for me, let me just speak out of my own experience. It came alive for me when I began to seriously practice some of the tools that the church has known about over all the centuries, but about which I was entirely ignorant. Whether it's the Ignatian exercises, or whether it's centering prayer, or what, Lectio Divina, any number of practices where I can experience that weekend and sit at the table with the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. And with all my hurts, and with all my pains, I can know that God loves me. And shifting identity does this. Shifting identity enabled me to look back at that moment when I walked out of the funeral, the church building at the funeral, and I could look back at that moment and I could see the grief, and I can even feel it again, but I no longer feel the embarrassment. The tears were good. The tears were right. I don't feel the embarrassment because I also, with the reframing that experience, helped me to see in that experience not the embarrassment, but the love. Because when I walk out of that building, what do I see? I see my best friend, the best man at my wedding, who flew in from Oklahoma there. And I see the chorus from Potter Children's Home there. And I see friends who I've known a long time there. And I see the love that they have for me. When we're stuck in the great sadness, we're fogged in. And we can only see the gray. And we can only feel the wounds. But when we learn to reframe our identity, to find our identity in the belovedness that God has for us, then we're able to see the love that is strewn across even the moments of woundedness. For me, that's one of the significant things about this story, this parable. Is it opens the door to love. When we've all got our facades up and our Hollywood fronts, and we don't allow the love of God to center us so that we can walk through the wounds. Doesn't mean the great sadness doesn't come. No, it comes. The wounds come. The wounds are there. But with our centeredness in love, we learn to walk through the wounds and to walk through the sadness. Not avoid it, not stuff it, not deny it, but to walk through it. Because it's okay to be sad when your identity is found in love. And the love will heal the sadness. Glory to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and will be forever.